I smiled, seeing Ryan's name flash across my phone screen, thinking he was calling about dinner plans. Instead, his voice came through cold and calculated. "I'm divorcing you," he announced, a hint of amusement in his tone. "And I've already sold the house. You'll need to find somewhere else to live by the end of the month." For a moment, I couldn't breathe as his words sliced through me like a blade. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra, special for you." I stood frozen between displays of spring flowers at Oakridge Garden Center, the cheerful colors blurring as Ryan's words echoed in my ears. Around me, families and couples browsed plants for homes I suddenly no longer had. The scent of damp soil and flowering jasmine felt suffocating now. The peaceful Saturday morning transformed into a nightmare in seconds. "Sarah, are you there?" Ryan asked, his impatience clear even through my shock. I could picture him in his home office, feet propped on the mahogany desk I'd restored myself, waiting for me to fall apart. "You sold our house?" I finally managed, keeping my voice low as I moved toward a quieter corner of the nursery. "You can't do that without my signature." My fingers gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, as if holding on might somehow reverse his words. He laughed. Actually laughed, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "Already done. The papers went through yesterday. I've been planning this for months." There was something in his voice I'd never heard before, a smugness, a satisfaction at delivering this blow. I gripped the edge of a wooden planter, steadying myself as the world tilted. What about my things? My mother's paintings? The memory? Boxes in the attic? My voice caught. "Our life together? You have until the 30th to get whatever you want. After that, anything left behind gets tossed." His tone was so matter-of-fact, as if we were discussing a simple business transaction and not the demolition of our 12-year marriage. The new owners take possession on the 1st. A young couple walked past, their fingers intertwined as they examined hanging baskets. The woman laughed at something he whispered in her ear. Had Ryan and I ever been like that? I couldn't remember now. "Why now?" I asked, my mind racing to make sense of this ambush. We'd had dinner together just last night, pad thai from our favorite place. He'd kissed me goodbye this morning when I left to meet Emma at the garden center. Nothing had seemed different. Nothing had warned me. "It's time for me to move on," Ryan said, his voice suddenly distant. "Vanessa and I need a fresh start, and your constant need for validation was becoming exhausting. You've been holding me back for years." Vanessa. The name hit me like a physical blow. His new assistant, 27 to my 42, with her marketing degree and perfect highlights. The woman who sent me a Christmas card last month, signed with a heart. "You're leaving me for your assistant?" The words came out in a whisper as pieces started falling into place. His late nights at the office, the business trips that seemed to multiply, the growing distance between us. The way he'd lock his phone when I entered a room. The mysterious texts that made him smile when he thought I wasn't looking. "She understands ambition," he replied coldly. "She doesn't make me feel guilty for working late or traveling for business. She supports my goals instead of dragging me down with her insecurities." Each word was a precise cut, targeting every doubt I'd ever voiced to him in confidence. I closed, my eyes breathing through the pain, aware of the garden center manager watching me with concern from behind a display of orchids. I felt something shift inside me, shock giving way to a quiet anger. "And our house? The one I renovated room by room while you were busy with your ambition? The house where we talked about starting a family? Already sold to Westlake developers. They're planning to tear it down anyway, so don't get sentimental. About your precious renovations, they're putting in luxury condos. It's the perfect location." His voice had an edge of triumph, as if he'd pulled off some clever business deal. "I got 300,000 over asking." The casual cruelty in his voice was so unlike the man I thought I'd married. Or perhaps this was who he'd always been, and I'd just been too blind to see it. The memories flashed through my mind. The way he'd dismiss my ideas at dinner parties, the subtle criticisms disguised as jokes, how he always positioned himself as the reasonable one when we disagreed. "I've transferred some money to your account," he continued, his tone suggesting I should be grateful. "Enough to get you set up in an apartment somewhere. Think of it as a parting gift. You never were very good with finances." My hand tightened around the phone. The garden center continued to bustle around me. A mother helping her daughter choose seeds, an elderly couple debating between rose varieties, a man in overalls loading bags of mulch onto a cart, families planning their perfect gardens while my life crumbled into dust. "Is that all?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. A small rebellion, not giving him the tears he probably expected. "My lawyer will be in touch with the divorce papers." "Don't make this difficult, Sarah. It's better for both of us this way." He paused, and for a moment I thought I heard a woman's voice in the background. "I've already moved most of my things out. I'm staying at the Madison until our new place is ready." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there, surrounded by life and growth and possibility, feeling as if I'd been hollowed out. The Japanese maple I'd come to buy for our anniversary next month suddenly seemed like a cruel joke. "Sarah?" My sister Emma appeared around the corner of the aisle, arms full of herb seedlings. "I found the most amazing lemon balm." She stopped, her smile fading as she saw my face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I lowered the phone, slowly, feeling as if my arm weighed 1,000 pounds. "Ryan just called," I said, the words sounding distant even to my own ears. "He's divorcing me. He's sold our house to developers. I have less than a month to find somewhere to live." Emma's expression changed from concern to fury in an instant. The seedlings tumbled from her arms, plastic pots clattering against the concrete floor. "He did what?" As I repeated his words, explaining about Vanessa and the development plans, my initial shock began to crystallize into something else. A determination I didn't know I possessed. People turned to stare at us, but I no longer cared. "He thinks he's won," I told Emma, my voice growing stronger with each word. "He thinks I'll just collapse without him, that I'll quietly take whatever scraps he throws my way and disappear into the background of his new life." Emma took my hands in hers, ignoring the spilled soil at our feet. "So, what are you going to do?" "You can stay with me as long as you need." I looked around at the plants I'd come to buy for the garden I no longer owned, and a strange calm settled over me. The garden center manager was still watching, now openly concerned. Somewhere in the background a child laughed. "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly, "but Ryan has severely underestimated me, and he's about to learn exactly how much." My name is Sarah Donovan, and until that morning at the garden center, I thought I had built a life I could count on. Ryan and I had been married for 12 years, meeting when we were both working at the same advertising agency in Chicago. I was a graphic designer with a growing portfolio. He was an account executive with ambition that radiated from him like heat. His confidence had drawn me in immediately. The way he commanded a room, the certainty in his voice when he spoke about the future. I'd always been more cautious, more measured, and something about his boundless self-assurance made me feel safe. "You balance me," he used to say in those early days, his hand warm against the small of my back. "You keep me grounded." Back then, I'd taken it as a compliment. We'd bought our house in Mapleton Heights 8 years ago, a 1920s craftsman with good bones but desperate for attention. The realtor had called it a handyman special, her voice carefully neutral as she pointed out the water damage in the kitchen ceiling, the cracked tiles in the bathroom, the ancient wiring that would need to be completely replaced. Ryan had been hesitant, calculating renovation costs against his 5-year career plan, but I had fallen in love with the built-in bookshelves, the original hardwood floors underneath layers of worn carpet, the way sunlight streamed through the bay windows in the late afternoon. I can see us here, I'd told him, standing in the empty living room. I can see our future. Ryan had agreed eventually, with the condition that I would manage the renovations since I was only working part-time anyway. My freelance design business wasn't bringing in as much as his corporate salary, so it made sense on paper. I threw myself into the project with everything I had, learning about electrical systems and plumbing, refinishing floors on my hands and knees, painting every wall myself to save money. I'd taken night classes in interior design at the community college, made friends with local contractors who taught me tricks of the trade. With each improvement, the house became more ours, or so I thought. Looking back, I could see how Ryan's attachment to the house had always been different from mine. For him, it was an investment, a line item on his personal balance sheet. For me, it was an extension of myself, a canvas where I'd poured my creativity and labor. The garden had been my latest project, transforming the patchy lawn and overgrown shrubs into a series of outdoor rooms with native plants and a small vegetable garden. The Japanese maple I'd gone to buy that day was meant to be the centerpiece of a new meditation space in the back corner of the yard. I had other dreams too, tentative, fragile dreams I'd only recently begun to voice. The home design blog I'd started 6 months ago that was slowly gaining followers. The idea of expanding my freelance work into a proper business with a small studio space, maybe even children, though at 42 that window was closing fast. Ryan had always been ambivalent about kids, pushing the conversation to next year whenever it came up. I realized now that next year had never been meant to arrive. After leaving the garden center with Emma, we drove to her apartment in silence. The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in like a stone dropping through water, creating ripples of panic that spread through my body. No home, no husband, no clear path forward. Emma kept glancing at me, her worry evident in the tight set of her mouth. "We'll figure this out," she said finally as we pulled into her parking space. "He can't just sell a house you both own. There must be some legal issue there." I nodded, though I wasn't sure. Our finances had always been Ryan's domain. He had insisted on handling the mortgage, the investments, the taxes. "You focus on making our house beautiful," he'd say, "and I'll focus on keeping a roof over our heads." It had seemed like a fair division of labor at the time. Now I wondered what else I'd missed, what other aspects of our life together had been built on a foundation of sand. Emma's apartment was small but welcoming, a one-bedroom with plants crowding every windowsill. My sister was 5 years younger, perpetually single by choice, and fiercely independent. We looked alike, with the same dark hair and hazel eyes, but where I tended to be reserved, Emma had always been outspoken. As a civil rights attorney, she spent her days fighting for others, a quality I suddenly found myself desperately grateful for. "You can have the bedroom," she said, setting her keys on the counter. "I'll take the couch." "I can't put you out like that," I protested weakly. "It's not negotiable." Her tone brooked no argument. "Now, tell me exactly what Ryan said about the house. Every detail." I sank onto her sofa and recounted the conversation as precisely as I could remember, including his comment about the papers. "Going through yesterday." Emma paced as I spoke, her expression growing darker. "This doesn't make sense," she said when I finished. "You can't sell a jointly owned property without both owners' signatures. Even if he forged your signature, which would be fraud, there are notarization requirements. And transferring money to your account? That sounds like he's trying to create evidence that you agreed to some kind of settlement." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What if the house isn't in both our names?" Emma stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "What if it's only in his name?" I don't actually know whose name is on the deed." The admission felt like a confession of unforgivable negligence. Emma's expression softened slightly. "When you bought it, Whose name was on the paperwork? I closed my eyes, trying to remember that day at the title company. There had been so many documents, and Ryan had been so efficient, telling me where to sign, explaining things in the rapid, simplified way he used when he thought a topic might bore me. I think both of ours, but we refinanced about 3 years ago when rates dropped. Ryan handled all of it. He just brought me papers to sign. Emma sat down beside me, her attorney face firmly in place. We need to find out exactly what you signed, and who legally owns that house. If your name is on the deed, he can't sell it without your consent. That sale would be invalid. She grabbed her laptop from the coffee table. Do you have online access to your financial accounts? I shook my head, embarrassment washing over me. Ryan manages all of that. I have my own checking account for household expenses and my business, but the mortgage, investments, retirement accounts, that's all Ryan. Something that might have been pity flickered across Emma's face, but she quickly masked it. Okay, we're going to start there. We need to know exactly what you own, what you owe, and what your rights are. We can check property records online. As Emma typed, I wandered to her kitchen window, looking out at the city skyline in the distance. I could see the church steeple from St. Mary's where we'd gotten married. Ryan handsome in his tailored suit, me floating on a cloud of tulle and promises. Had I ever really known him? Or had I just known the version of himself he'd carefully constructed for me to see? I'd always thought of myself as intelligent, independent even. I had my own career, my own friends, my own interests. But somehow, over the years, I'd allowed Ryan to take control of the fundamental parts of our life together. I'd focused on making our house beautiful while remaining blind to who held the deed. I'd spent a decade becoming an expert on color, palettes and furniture arrangement while knowing nothing about our mortgage or investments. I'd been so busy creating the perfect backdrop for our marriage that I'd missed the cracks forming in its foundation. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. Forgot to mention, I need the Audi back by Monday. Company car, technically. You can use the old Honda until you get your own transportation sorted out. The casualness of it, the complete disregard for how I would manage without a reliable car, sent a fresh wave of fury through me. The Audi had been a company perk that arrived 2 years ago, replacing my Honda as my daily vehicle while the older car sat mostly unused in our garage. Another thing he'd controlled without me fully realizing it. Sarah, Emma called from the living room, her voice tight. I found the property records for your house. I returned to the sofa, sitting beside her as she turned the laptop so I could see the screen. There was our address, the purchase date, the most recent assessment value, and under owner of record, Ryan Donovan, just Ryan. Not Ryan and Sarah. Not even a hint that I existed. I don't understand, I whispered, though a part of me was beginning to understand all too well. We bought it together. I was there. I signed the papers. Emma scrolled down, showing the history of the property. It looks like the deed was transferred solely to Ryan's name during the refinance. There's his signature, dated May 15th, 3 years ago. The refinance. When rates had dropped so dramatically that Ryan said we'd be throwing money away, not to take advantage. He'd handled everything, bringing me papers to sign one evening after a day when I'd been sick with the flu. I'd trusted him completely, signing where he indicated without reading the documents. Why would I need to read them? He was my husband. We were partners. He did this on purpose, I said slowly, the realization crystallizing. He planned this years ago. Emma didn't contradict me. It's possible. Or maybe this was just an opportunity he took advantage of when your marriage started to falter. No, I said, certainty hardening within me. Ryan doesn't do anything without a plan. He must have known even then that he would want out someday. He was making sure he could leave on his terms. Another thought struck me. The money he transferred to my account, I need to check how much it is. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. There was the transfer, just as he'd said. $25,000 from our joint account. $25,000, I said, my voice hollow. For 12 years of marriage and a house worth nearly $1 million, Emma's jaw tightened. This isn't over, Sarah. Not by a long shot. If he transferred that money as some kind of unofficial divorce settlement without proper legal proceedings, we might have grounds to challenge the house sale, too. For the first time since Ryan's call, I felt a flicker of hope. Not that we would reconcile. I was already beginning to understand that our marriage had been broken far longer than I'd realized, but that I might not be as powerless as he assumed. What do we do now? I asked. Emma closed her laptop with a decisive snap. Now, we call my friend Diane. She's the best divorce attorney in the city, and Ryan is about to discover that he's made a serious miscalculation. Diane Crawford's office was located in a renovated Victorian in the city's financial district. The building's exterior maintained its historical charm, but inside, everything was sleek, modern efficiency. Much like Diane herself, who greeted us in a pristine charcoal suit, her silver hair cut in a precise bob that framed her face like an exclamation point. Emma's told me the basics, she said, leading us into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. But I'll need you to walk me through everything from the beginning. For the third time that day, I recounted Ryan's call, the revelation about the house, and what we'd discovered about the deed transfer. With each retelling, the story became both more real and more surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life while recognizing my own face on screen. Diane took meticulous notes, occasionally interrupting with questions that cut to the heart of issues I hadn't even considered. What was the source of the down payment for the house? Had I contributed to mortgage payments? Did I have documentation of the improvements I'd made to the property? Was my name on any other major assets? From what you've told me, she said after nearly an hour, your husband has been methodically separating assets and preparing for this divorce for years. The deed transfer during the refinance wasn't just opportunistic, it was strategic. I stared at the spotless conference table. You mean he never intended to stay married to me? I can't speak to his intentions, Diane replied, her tone softening slightly. But I can tell you this pattern suggests long-term planning. The good news is that courts don't look kindly on spouses who attempt to hide or transfer marital assets before divorce proceedings. She turned her computer monitor toward us, showing a document she'd pulled up during our conversation. This is the property deed from your initial purchase, and yes, both your names are listed as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Emma leaned forward. So the transfer during refinancing may constitute fraud if Sarah wasn't properly informed of what she was signing, Diane finished. Especially if she can demonstrate that she contributed significantly to the property, either financially or through improvements that increased its value. A mix of vindication and fresh betrayal washed over me. The evidence was right there in black and white. Ryan had methodically erased my name from our home, all while I was busy making it more valuable for him to eventually sell. There's more, I said quietly, pulling out my phone. I'd spent the morning combing through my emails, looking for anything related to our finances. I found these messages from our insurance company. I handed the phone to Diane, who scrolled through the emails, notifications about policy changes I'd archived without reading carefully, changes to our homeowner's insurance, the removal of my jewelry from our valuable items rider, my name deleted as a beneficiary on his life insurance policy. The earliest one is from 2.5 years ago, I said, right around when Vanessa started working for him. Diane's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. This establishes a clear timeline. Do you have access to your joint? Accounts? Credit card statements? I shook my head. Ryan handled all of that. I have my own checking account and credit card for household expenses and my business, but everything else was managed by him. That will be our first order of business, Diane said decisively. We need to file for divorce immediately, before he can move or hide any more assets. We'll include emergency motions to freeze accounts and prevent the finalization of the house sale. Can we do that? I asked. He said the papers went through yesterday. Real estate transactions don't happen instantly, Diane explained. There's typically a closing period, especially with a development company involved. If we move quickly, we may be able to block it. She paused, studying me. You should also be prepared for what we might find when we get access to your financial records. What do you mean? In cases like this, where one spouse has been systematically preparing for divorce, we often discover other unpleasant surprises, hidden accounts, unusual expenditures, evidence of the affair that goes back further than you might have suspected. My stomach clenched at the thought, but I nodded. I want to know everything. As Diane outlined our next steps, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Ryan. I showed the screen to Emma and Diane. Answer it, Diane suggested. Put it on speaker. But don't mention you're talking to a lawyer yet. I took a deep breath and accepted the call. Hello? Sarah, Ryan's voice was clipped, businesslike. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, and I want to be reasonable about this. The money I transferred should be enough for 6 months' rent somewhere decent while you figure things out. I've also decided you can take the bedroom furniture and your crafting supplies. My crafting supplies. As if my design business was just a cute hobby. That's very generous, I said, struggling to keep my voice neutral. And the house? The one we bought together? As I told you, it's been sold. That's non-negotiable. His tone had an edge now. I've worked hard to build my career and set us up financially. The house is an investment that's finally paying off. And investment I spent 8 years improving, I pointed out. Every renovation increased its value. That garden doubled the curb appeal. And I appreciate that, which is why I'm being generous with the settlement. I could hear the impatience creeping into his voice. Look, Sarah, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We've grown apart. These things happen. Diane nodded, encouragingly at me, mouthing, Keep him talking. When did they happen, Ryan? When did you and Vanessa start? There was a pause. This isn't about Vanessa, isn't it? Because I found emails showing you started removing me from our insurance policies 2.5 years ago, right when she started working for you. Another longer pause. You're making connections that aren't there. The policy changes were just smart financial planning. Planning for what? Our divorce? Don't be dramatic. His voice had cooled to the tone he used with difficult clients. I've always managed our finances with an eye toward efficiency. You never showed any interest in those details. Because you deliberately excluded me, I thought, but held my tongue. I need to know about the house sale, I said instead. What stage is it in? Have you closed already? We're set to close next week. The buyers have already wired the earnest money. There was a note of satisfaction in his voice that made my skin crawl. It's a done deal, Sarah. Westlake isn't going to back out. They've been trying to acquire property in that neighborhood for years. Diane was writing rapidly on a legal pad, showing me what she'd written, ask about proceeds. And the money from the sale? Where is that going? I asked. Into investments for my future. Our future, I should say. Vanessa has some excellent connections in commercial real estate. He paused. Listen, I didn't call to argue. I wanted to let you know I'll be stopping by tomorrow to pick up some files from my home office. I'll text before I come. My home office. Already the house was no longer ours in his mind. Had it ever been? Fine, I said. I'll make sure I'm not there. Good, that's probably best. He hesitated. And Sarah? I am sorry it ended this way. We had some good years. Before I could respond, he'd hung up. I set the phone down carefully, as if it might bite. Well, Diane said. That was illuminating. He's already planning to invest the house proceeds with Vanessa, I said, the reality of it hitting me anew. Money from the home I helped build, going to set up his new life with her. Not if we move fast enough, Diane replied, already reaching for her desk phone. I'm going to call a colleague who specializes in real estate law. We need to file emergency motions today. While Diane made her calls, Emma squeezed my hand. You did great. We're going to fight this. I nodded, but a new thought was taking shape. He said he's coming to the house tomorrow for files. If he's been planning this for years. He might have been removing documents gradually, Emma finished. Or he might have left something important behind. I need to get there before he does, I said. I need to see what he's coming for. After leaving Diane's office with a plan in motion and several emergency filings underway, Emma drove me to what I still couldn't help thinking of as my home. The familiar street with its row of mature oak trees seemed unchanged, oblivious to the fact that my life had been shattered. Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor, was watering her roses. She waved as we pulled into the driveway, and I managed a weak wave in return. Are you sure you want to do this now? Emma asked as I stared at the front door, suddenly hesitant. We can come back later. No, I need to do this. I took a deep breath. I need to see what he's been hiding. The house was eerily quiet when we entered, everything exactly as I'd left it that morning. Dishes from breakfast still in the sink, a half-empty coffee mug on the counter. My gardening magazine open on the coffee table, marked with sticky notes. For projects I'd planned for the spring. Projects for a garden that would soon be bulldozed for luxury condos. Let's start with his office, I suggested. Ryan's home office was the most organized room in the house, meticulously arranged with modern furniture and very little decoration beyond his framed business school diploma and a few awards from the advertising industry. The large desk dominated the space, with a sleek computer setup and a row of matching file boxes on the built-in shelves. What exactly are we looking for? Emma asked, eyeing the intimidatingly tidy space. I'm not sure, I admitted. But Ryan never leaves important documents at home unless they're in his safe. He has a safe? I nodded, moving to the abstract painting that hung on the wall opposite his desk. I removed it, revealing a small wall safe. The combination is his. Father's birthday, I said, turning the dial. He thought I didn't know, but I saw him open it once when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The safe swung open, revealing several folders, a small jewelry box, and a stack of documents. I removed them all, setting them on the desk. Birth certificates, passports, social security cards, I said, flipping through the first folder. All normal. The jewelry box contained his grandfather's vintage Rolex and cufflinks, valuable but not unexpected. The next folder, however, made me pause. Investment statements, I said, scanning the pages. But these aren't accounts I recognize. The statements were addressed to Ryan at his office, not our home, and they showed regular deposits dating back 4 years, substantial deposits that couldn't have come from his salary alone. Emma leaned over my shoulder. Offshore accounts? Is that the Cayman Islands? I nodded slowly, the betrayal cutting deeper with each page I turned. Not only had Ryan been planning his exit, but he'd been hiding money, our money, for years. The last folder contained real estate documents, including recent correspondence about a beachfront property in Florida. The offer letter was dated 6 months ago, with both Ryan and Vanessa's names listed as potential buyers. 6 months, I whispered. He was shopping for their dream home while still living in ours. Emma's expression hardened. We need to take all of this to Diane. This is exactly the kind of evidence she needs. As we gathered the documents, I noticed something odd about the row of file boxes on Ryan's shelves. One was slightly askew, breaking the perfect symmetry he insisted upon. I pulled it down and opened it. Inside was a laptop I'd never seen before, sleek and expensive, with a small notebook tucked beside it. I opened the notebook to find pages of handwritten notes in Ryan's precise script. Ideas for a new marketing agency, business plans, potential client lists. Many of the names were clients of his current firm, people he'd built relationships with using the company's resources. He's planning to start his own agency, I realized. Probably taking clients with him. Emma picked up the laptop. Do you know the password? I shook my head but tried anyway. His birthday, his childhood street address, his father's name. Nothing. Worked. Wait, I said suddenly. Try Vanessa's birthday. March 17th, Emma typed, and the screen came to life. How did you know that? She mentioned it at the holiday party. Ryan made a big deal about getting her a cake at the office. A memory that had seemed innocent at the time now took on a much darker meaning. The laptop contained emails between Ryan and Vanessa dating back over 2 years, discussions of their future together, plans for the business they would start, how they would time his divorce for minimal financial impact. There were spreadsheets tracking my schedule, noting times when I'd be away from home. Lists of items in our house categorized as take or leave. A detailed timeline for their life after I was out of the picture. But most devastating was a folder of photographs. Ryan and Vanessa together in hotel rooms, on beaches, in restaurants. Places he'd told me were business trips. Moments stolen from our marriage while I was building us a home. Emma trailed off, unable to find words adequate for the methodical betrayal spread before us. This is who he really is, I finished for her. A strange calm settling over me. And now I have proof. That night, after we'd delivered copies of everything to Diane and secured the originals in Emma's apartment safe, I couldn't sleep. I lay on Emma's bed staring at the ceiling fan as it rotated hypnotically, my mind replaying moments from my marriage like scenes from a movie I was seeing for the first time with clear eyes. The signs had been there all along. Subtle shifts, and small betrayals I'd explained away or overlooked entirely. As dawn approached with still no sleep in sight, I moved to the living room and began writing them down in Emma's notebook, needing to make sense of how I'd missed what now seemed so obvious. There was the sudden insistence on separate vacations. 2 years ago. Ryan claiming he needed solitude to recharge while encouraging me to take girls' trips with friends I'd barely seen in years. You deserve some fun, he'd said, practically pushing me out the door while booking his own meditation retreat that I now knew had been a romantic getaway with Vanessa. There was the home renovation project that had mysteriously stalled when it came to the master bathroom, the one upgrade I had desperately wanted. Let's wait until next quarter, Ryan would say. The market's unstable. All while he was quietly liquidating assets and moving money offshore, planning for a future that didn't include me or our home. There were the business dinners that multiplied like rabbits, the late-night calls he took in the garage, the sudden password changes on all his devices. Client confidentiality, he'd explained with that dismissive smile he used when he thought I was being intellectually uncurious. And I'd believed him because to do otherwise would have meant confronting a truth I wasn't ready to face. Emma found me on the couch at 6, the notebook filled with page after page of retrospective clarity. Couldn't sleep? She asked, heading straight for the coffee maker. I've been thinking about all the signs I missed, I said, my voice hoarse from a night without rest. They were everywhere, Emma. I just didn't want to see them. She brought over 2 mugs of coffee, settling beside me on the couch. Don't do that to yourself. Hindsight makes prophets of us all. It's not just hindsight, I insisted. It's pattern recognition. Ryan's been managing me our entire relationship, positioning himself as the practical one, the smart one with the financial acumen, and I played right into it because it was easier than challenging him. You trusted your husband, Emma countered. That's not a character flaw. But I abandoned my own agency, I said, the realization sharp as glass. I let him handle everything that seemed complicated or unpleasant, and I focused on what I thought I was good at. Making things beautiful, creating a home. I laughed bitterly. A home he was planning to sell out from under me. Emma was quiet, for a moment, sipping her coffee. When did he start treating you like you were incapable? The question caught me off guard. He didn't. Not exactly. Didn't he? She pressed gently. The Ryan I saw at family gatherings was always explaining things to you, always correcting little details in your stories, always making those jokes about how you'd be lost without him. I stared into my coffee mug, memories surfacing. The way Ryan would intercept questions about our finances at dinner parties, answering before I could speak. Sarah doesn't trouble her creative mind with boring numbers, he'd say with an indulgent smile. The casual dismissal of my business aspirations as a nice little hobby when talking to his colleagues. The constant reminders of how he'd rescued me from living paycheck to paycheck when we met. It was so gradual, I said slowly. When we first got together, he seemed to admire my creativity, my different way of looking at the world. He said we complemented each other perfectly. Then somewhere along the way, my different perspective became impractical. My creativity became whimsy. My interests became cute distractions. Classic diminishment, Emma noted. Lawyer mode engaging even at this early hour. He undermined your confidence in small ways until you naturally deferred to him on important matters. I remembered a particularly painful incident 3 years ago when I'd pitched my design services to one of Ryan's colleagues who was launching a new product line. Ryan had stepped in mid-presentation, apologizing to his friend for my enthusiasm and promising to send over the contact information for a more established firm. Later, he'd framed it as doing me a favor, protecting me from a project that was too large for my current capabilities. He said he was looking out for me, I murmured, making sure I didn't overextend myself or make commitments I couldn't fulfill. And I believed him because I paused, confronting the hardest truth. Because part of me believed I wasn't capable, that I needed his guidance. That's how emotional manipulation works, Emma said. It plants seeds of doubt that grow into forests of insecurity. Another memory surfaced, Ryan convincing me to turn down a commission for a boutique hotel redesign because it might distract from my duties at home. I'd been excited about the opportunity, my first major commercial project, but he'd raised so many concerns, the time commitment, the potential for failure, the impact on our home life, that I'd eventually declined. The designer who took the job had been featured in Architectural Digest 6 months later. I gave up so many opportunities, I realized. Not because I didn't want them, but because he convinced me I wasn't ready for them. Emma squeezed my hand. That stops now. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Court filing complete. Temporary hold on property sale ordered pending hearing. Emergency meeting at my office, 9 a.m. I showed Emma the message, relief washing over me. She did it. We've stopped the sale, at least temporarily. That's step 1, Emma said. But there's something else we need to address immediately. She pointed to my phone. Ryan said he's coming to the house today for those files, the files we now have. He's going to know you've been in the safe. My pulse quickened. He'll realize we have evidence of the offshore accounts, the plans with Vanessa. Exactly. And men like Ryan, men who've spent years carefully constructing their exit, don't react well when their plans are threatened. I hadn't considered this aspect, that discovering Ryan's betrayal might put me in a different kind of danger. The Ryan I thought I knew would never hurt me physically, but the Ryan I thought I knew also wouldn't have systematically erased me from our assets while planning a life with another woman. What do we do? I asked. First, you're not going back to that house alone. Period. Emma's tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. Second, we document everything in the house immediately. Photographs, inventory lists, anything of value. If he realizes you've found his secret files, he might start removing other things. She was right. The safe had contained only the documentation of his deception, not the artifacts of our life together. The artwork we'd collected on our travels. My grandmother's silver service, carefully polished and displayed in the dining room hutch. The first edition books Ryan had inherited from his father, items of both financial and sentimental value. "He'll be furious," I said quietly. "Yes, he will." Emma didn't sugarcoat it. "Which is why we need to move strategically now. You have rights, Sarah, regardless of whose name is on the deed. Diane will help assert those rights legally, but we need to protect yourself in the meantime." My phone buzzed again. "Ryan, this time. Coming by the house at noon to get those files. No need to be there." I showed Emma the message. "He's giving me an order, not asking." "Typical," she muttered. "He's still operating under the assumption that you'll follow his directions." "Without question. What if we're there when he arrives?" I suggested. "Not alone. With Diane, maybe? Let him know immediately that we're challenging the house sale." Emma considered this, then shook her head. "Too confrontational at this stage. We want him overconfident, thinking his plan is still working. The court order blocking the sale will blindside him, which gives us a tactical advantage." This kind of strategic thinking was foreign to me, plotting moves and counter-moves like a chess game. But I could see the wisdom in Emma's approach. Ryan had spent years creating this elaborate exit strategy. Letting him know too soon that we'd discovered it would only give him time to cover his tracks or create new obstacles. "So what do we do?" I asked again. "We go to the house now before he arrives, photograph everything, get the most important items out, and leave before he shows up. Then we meet with Diane and plan our next move." 2 hours later, we had systematically documented every room in the house. Each piece of artwork, each valuable item, each space I had lovingly designed, all captured in photographs time-stamped and backed up to the cloud. Emma had insisted we focus on items with clear financial or sentimental value. My grandmother's jewelry still in the bedroom dresser, the antique silver tea service Ryan had entirely forgotten about, the artwork we'd collected during our travels that had mysteriously not made it onto Ryan's take list. "What about my clothes? My personal things?" I asked as we worked through the master bedroom. "Take what you need for the next few weeks," Emma advised. "But don't strip the place bare. Remember, we want him to think his plan is still on track." Azao. I packed a suitcase with essentials. I came across the small velvet box at the back of my drawer. My engagement ring, which I'd stopped wearing months ago after losing weight, made it too loose. I'd meant to have it resized, but somehow never got around to it. Ryan hadn't even noticed its absence. I opened the box, staring at the diamond that had once symbolized our future together. The stone caught the light, reflecting tiny rainbows, onto the ceiling, beautiful, brilliant, and cold, just like my marriage had become. I tucked the ring into my pocket. Whatever its monetary value, it represented something I needed to remember. How easy it was to be blinded by beauty while missing the truth beneath the surface. We were just loading the last items into Emma's car when my phone rang. Not Ryan, but a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Donovan? This is Jennifer Mason from Westlake Development." The woman's voice was brisk, professional. "I'm calling regarding the property at 1428 Maple Street. We've received notice of a court order halting the sale, and I was hoping to get some clarification." My heart raced as I looked at Emma, mouthing Westlake silently. She nodded encouragingly. "Yes, that's correct," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The sale of the property is being legally contested." "I see." Jennifer's tone cooled slightly. "Mr. Donovan assured us there would be no complications with this transaction. He didn't mention any disputes." "I'm sure he didn't," I replied, "but I'm afraid my husband wasn't authorized to sell the property without my consent. My attorney has filed for an emergency injunction while ownership is determined." There was a pause, then. "This is unexpected. We've already made a substantial earnest money payment to Mr. Donovan. A jolt of alarm shot through me. He's already received payment? The initial deposit, yes. 20% of the purchase price was transferred yesterday, with the remainder due at closing next week. Her voice took on an edge. Mrs. Donovan, if there's a legitimate issue with this sale, Westlake will be forced to take legal action to recover our funds. I understand, I said, my mind racing to calculate what 20% of the house value would be. Nearly $200,000. Money that should have been sitting in escrow but that Ryan had apparently already accessed. My attorney will be in touch with your legal department today. After ending the call, I relayed the conversation to Emma. This changes things, she said grimly. If Ryan's already spent that deposit, he's committed fraud. Not just against you, but against Westlake. They're not going to take that lightly. Will they go after him legally? Almost certainly, and that works in our favor. Emma checked her watch. It's almost 9. Let's get to Diane's office and tell her about this development. As we pulled away from the house, my home for 8 years, now the centerpiece of a legal battle I never wanted, I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. The grief was for the life I thought I'd had, the partnership I believed in, the future I'd planned. The clarity was harder to define, but somehow more powerful, a recognition that I'd been living in a beautiful illusion crafted by a man who had never truly seen me as an equal. You know what's ironic? I said as we drove toward downtown. I spent all those years believing I needed Ryan to handle the complicated parts of life. But in the end, I'm the one untangling the mess he created. Emma smiled, a fierce, proud smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. That's not irony, Sarah. That's justice. And for the first time since Ryan's devastating phone call, I felt something like hope stirring beneath the wreckage of my marriage. Not hope for reconciliation, but hope for myself and the life I might build from these ashes. A life where I wouldn't need anyone's permission to pursue my dreams or validation to know my worth. We arrived at Diane's office with 10 minutes to spare, the car filled with the physical remnants of my marriage and my mind filled with a growing list of warning signs I'd ignored for far too long, signs that now served as flashing beacons, illuminating not just the path behind me but the road ahead, a road I would navigate on my own terms. Diane Crawford's office was already humming with activity when we arrived, her team of paralegals moving with purposeful efficiency between glass-walled conference rooms. She greeted us at the door herself, elegant and imposing in a tailored navy suit. We have developments, she said, leading us into her corner office, where a young associate was already setting up a presentation on a large screen. Several, in fact. I explained about the call from Westlake Development and Ryan's premature access to the deposit funds. Diane's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with predatory focus. That's actually perfect timing, she said, because we've discovered something interesting about your house, Sarah. The associate, a woman Diane introduced as Maya, pulled up a series of documents on the screen. These are the original property. Records from when you and Ryan purchased the house, she explained. And here's where it gets interesting. She zoomed in on the financing details. The down payment for the house didn't come solely from joint funds as your husband claimed. 20% came from an inheritance you received from your maternal grandfather. I stared at the document in confusion. That's right. My grandfather left me some money when I was 25. We used it for the down payment when we bought the house 3 years later. But how is that important now? Diane leaned forward. Because under state law, inherited funds remain separate property unless explicitly commingled. You used your inheritance for the down payment, which means you have a separate property interest in the house that supersedes the later deed transfer. Emma made a small, surprised sound. Even though Sarah signed the refinancing documents? Even then, Diane confirmed. Because Ryan didn't disclose the effect of the deed transfer, and because he can't show that Sarah was compensated for her separate property interest, We have grounds to challenge not just the current sale, but the deed transfer itself. I tried to process this information. So you're saying... I'm saying that regardless of whose name is on the deed now, you have an ownership claim to the house that Ryan cannot erase. A claim that should have been addressed during the refinancing but wasn't. My inheritance, I murmured, remembering the modest sum that had seemed like a fortune to my younger self. Money I'd been saving for something important until Ryan convinced me that investing in real estate was the smartest possible use for it. Ryan always talked about it as our down payment. I didn't realize it made any legal difference. It makes all the difference, Diane said. And there's more. Maya clicked to the next slide, showing a series of home valuation reports. These are professional appraisals of your property value over time, she explained. The initial purchase, price, the value after major renovations, and the current market value. The numbers told a clear story, purchased for $620,000, now worth nearly $950,000, with the most significant increases coming after major renovation projects, the ones I had managed and largely executed myself. Under equitable distribution principles, Diane continued, your contributions to the increased value of the marital property must be taken into account, regardless of the deed status. The fact that you personally managed renovations that substantially increase the property value strengthens your position considerably. I have receipts, I said suddenly, and before and after photos of every project. My design blog documented all the major renovations with timestamps and cost breakdowns. Diane's smile was razor sharp. Perfect. Documentation is exactly what we need. But what about the sale? Emma asked. Ryan's already taken money from Westlake. That's where things get even more interesting, Diane replied, nodding to Maya to continue. The next slide showed a timeline of events, with yesterday's date prominently highlighted. The temporary restraining order blocking the sale was issued at 8:43 a.m. today, Maya explained. But according to the records you provided, Ryan received the earnest money from Westlake yesterday. This means he was legally obligated to place those funds in an escrow account until closing. Instead, Diane interjected, based on the bank records we subpoenaed this morning, he transferred the funds to a personal account, then immediately wired a significant portion offshore. I felt a chill. He was already planning to disappear with the money. It certainly appears that way, Diane agreed, which constitutes wire fraud among other potential criminal charges. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Ryan hadn't just been planning to divorce me. He'd been orchestrating a complete financial vanishing act. The house sale wasn't just about starting a new life with Vanessa. It was about liquidating assets and moving them beyond my reach. So what happens now? I asked. Now we use every one of these facts as leverage, Diane said. I've already contacted Westlake's legal team about the potential fraud issue. They're understandably concerned and have agreed to cooperate with our injunction until ownership is clarified. She pulled up another document on her tablet. I've also drafted an emergency motion for the court to freeze all of Ryan's assets, based on the evidence of fund transfers and potential fraud. Given the circumstances, I believe we have a strong case for the judge to grant it immediately. Emma leaned forward. And the house? The house remains in limbo for now, which works. In our favor, neither Ryan nor Westlake can proceed with the sale while our claims are being adjudicated. Diane turned to me. What we need from you now, Sarah, is anything that further documents your contribution to the property value or proves your separate property interest. My mind raced through possibilities. My design blog has every renovation documented, and I might have the original bank statement showing the transfer from my inheritance account for the down payment. It would be in the files at home. Excellent, Diane said. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it might be the most valuable of all. She nodded to Maya, who brought up the final slide, a close-up of the refinancing documents with Ryan's signature highlighted. When examining these documents more carefully, Diane explained, we noticed something peculiar about the notarization. The notary stamp belonged to Patricia Vega, who works at Ryan's company, but according to the date stamp, she notarized this document on March 15th, when company records show she was actually on a business trip to Seattle. I stared at the document, not immediately grasping the significance. What does that mean? It means, Emma said slowly, her legal mind connecting the dots, that the notarization might be fraudulent, which could invalidate the entire refinancing document. And if the refinancing document is invalid, Diane continued, then the deed transfer is also invalid, which means your name would still legally be on the deed, making the sale to Westlake impossible without your consent. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. Ryan's carefully constructed plan, built over years of meticulous preparation, might be undone by a single oversight. A fraudulent notarization that he probably never expected anyone to investigate. How do we prove the notary wasn't there? I asked. We've already subpoenaed Ms. Vega's travel records and company expense reports, Maya replied. If she was indeed in Seattle, as preliminary records suggest, we'll have concrete evidence of notary fraud. Which is a criminal offense, Diane added. One that Ryan would have difficulty explaining away. For the first time since Ryan's devastating phone call, I felt a surge of something beyond anger or confusion, a fierce satisfaction that his own arrogance might be his undoing. He had been so confident in his plan, so certain of his ability to control every variable, that he'd cut corners where he shouldn't have. When will we know for sure? I asked. The records should be available by the end of day, Maya said. In the meantime, we've already filed for the emergency asset freeze based on the wire transfers alone. And what about Ryan? Emma asked. When will he find out about all of this? Diane checked her watch. The restraining order on the house sale would have been served to both Ryan and Westlake this morning. As for the asset freeze, once the judge grants it, which I expect to happen within hours, banks will be notified immediately. My phone buzzed in my purse, once, twice, then a third time in rapid succession. I pulled it out to find multiple messages from Ryan. What the hell did you do? Call me immediately. This is not a game, Sarah. You're making a huge mistake. I showed the messages to Diane and Emma, my hand trembling slightly. Ryan had never spoken to me with such naked aggression before. He's received the restraining order, Diane noted calmly, and he's reacting exactly as expected, with intimidation rather than explanation. Should I respond? I asked. Not yet, Diane advised. Let him stew while we gather the remaining evidence. His emotional state will work to our advantage during negotiations. As she spoke, my phone rang, Ryan calling now, too impatient for text messages. I declined the call, feeling a strange mix of fear and power in that simple action. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, I was setting the terms of our communication. He's going to be furious when he can't access his accounts, I said, imagining Ryan's reaction when he discovered the extent of our countermeasures. Good, Emma replied fiercely. Let him feel a fraction of the helplessness he intended for you. My phone buzzed again, another text from Ryan. I'm coming to the house. We need to talk. I showed this message to Diane, who frowned slightly. That changes our timeline. Maya, expedite the asset freeze filing. I want it in place before Mr. Donovan has a chance to move any more funds. She turned to me. As for you, Sarah, I strongly advise against meeting him alone, especially when he's in this state. I won't, I promised. But I do need to get those bank statements from home if they'll help our case. I'll go with her, Emma volunteered immediately. We'll grab the documents and leave before Ryan arrives. Diane nodded reluctantly. Be quick. And if he shows up while you're there, do not engage in any substantive discussion. Refer all questions to me. As we prepared to leave, Maya handed me a business card. This has my direct number. Call immediately if you feel unsafe or if Mr. Donovan becomes aggressive. We can have a police officer meet you at the house if necessary. The seriousness of her tone drove home the reality of my situation. The man I had shared a bed with for 12 years, the man I had believed would never hurt me, was now someone I needed protection from. Not because he had necessarily become dangerous, but because I no longer knew what he was capable of when his plans were threatened. In the car, Emma drove with focused intensity, occasionally glancing at me. "Are you okay?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "Everything feels unreal, like I'm watching someone else's life unravel." "That's normal," she assured me. "You're in shock, processing multiple betrayals simultaneously." "It's not just the betrayal," I said slowly. "It's realizing how completely I misunderstood my own marriage. I thought we were partners building a life together. But for Ryan, it was always about positioning himself for the next move." We pulled onto our street, my street, and I was struck by how ordinary everything looked. Mrs. Peterson was still tending her roses. The Sullivan kids were riding bikes in their driveway. The maple trees that lined the sidewalk still cast dappled shadows across lawns that needed mowing after the recent rains. Nothing in this peaceful suburban tableau reflected the chaos that had engulfed my life in the past 24 hours. Emma parked in the driveway, and we hurried inside. The house was silent, just as we'd left it earlier that morning. I headed straight for the file cabinet in the spare bedroom, where I kept important personal documents, birth certificates, tax returns, and hopefully, the inheritance records we needed. As I sorted through the neatly labeled folders, Emma kept watch by the window. "Any sign of the bank statements?" she called. "Not yet," I replied, thumbing through a folder labeled Family Documents. There were birth certificates, my parents' marriage license, my grandfather's will, but no bank statements showing the inheritance transfer. "Try the basement storage," Emma suggested. "Didn't you say that's where you keep older financial records?" Nodded, heading down to the finished basement that served as my design studio. Along one wall stood a row of plastic storage bins, each meticulously labeled by year. I pulled down the one marked Financial Records 2013-2015, the period when we'd purchased the house. Inside, beneath tax returns and utility bills, I found a manila envelope labeled Inheritance House Purchase. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, revealing exactly what we needed. Bank statements showing the transfer of my inheritance into the down payment account. Correspondence with the estate attorney confirming the inheritance's origin. And, most importantly, a letter I'd forgotten writing to Ryan at the time, expressing how meaningful it was to use my grandfather's gift for our first home together. "Found it?" I called to Emma, who had followed me downstairs. "Everything we need." She examined the documents, nodding with satisfaction. "This is perfect. Clear evidence of separate property used for the down payment." As we gathered the papers, a car door slammed outside. Emma rushed to the window, then grabbed my arm. "It's Ryan. We need to go. Now." My heart raced as we hurried up the stairs, but we were too late. The front door opened just as we reached the main floor, and Ryan stood in the doorway, his expression a mask of barely controlled rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, blocking our exit. He looked different somehow, his usual polished appearance disrupted by wrinkled clothes and uncombed hair. The man who prided himself on perfect presentation at all times was coming undone at the seams. "We're just leaving," Emma said calmly, positioning herself slightly in front of me. "Sarah needed to collect some documents." Ryan's gaze fixed on the folder in my hands. "What documents? What are you up to, Sarah?" "Legal documents," I replied, summoning a steadiness I didn't entirely feel. "For my attorney." His face darkened. "Your attorney? You've been married to me for 12 years. And the first sign of trouble you run to a lawyer instead of talking to me? The first sign of trouble? I repeated incredulously. You called me yesterday to announce you were divorcing me and had sold our house without my knowledge. When exactly was I supposed to talk to you? I was trying to make things simpler, he snapped. A clean break that would let us both move on. But now you've complicated everything with this restraining order nonsense. Complicated? Emma interjected, unable to contain herself. You committed fraud, Ryan. You sold property you didn't fully own and transferred funds illegally. Ryan's gaze shifted to her, cold and dismissive. This doesn't concern you, Emma. This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, I corrected quietly. Soon to be, anyway. And actually, it does concern Emma. She's helping me protect myself. Protect yourself? He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. From what? I transferred money. To your account. I was going to let you keep all the furniture. I was being more than fair. Fair? The word ignited something in me. All the anger and hurt I'd been holding back. You secretly removed my name from the deed to our house during refinancing. You hid money in offshore accounts. You were planning this exit for years while pretending to be building a life with me. Which part of that strikes you as fair, Ryan? He flinched slightly, then recovered. You're exaggerating. I made prudent financial decisions for our future. For your future, I corrected. With Vanessa. I found the laptop, Ryan. I saw the emails, the photos, the timeline you created for discarding me like outdated furniture. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. You had no right to go through my personal property. Like you had no right to sell our house? I took a step toward him, suddenly unafraid. The house that I helped buy with my inheritance? The house that's worth almost $1 million now because of the renovations I managed? That house, Ryan? He stared at me, clearly shocked by both my knowledge and my tone. Your inheritance was a drop in the bucket compared to what I've contributed over the years. That's not how the law sees it, Emma interjected. Sarah's separate property interest gives her a claim regardless of the deed transfer. And speaking of that transfer, interesting choice, having Patricia Vega notarize documents when she was in Seattle. The color drained from Ryan's face. What are you talking about? We know the notarization was fraudulent, I said quietly. Which invalidates the entire refinancing document, including the deed transfer that put the house solely in your name. He took a step back, his carefully constructed facade crumbling visibly. That's ridiculous. There must be some mistake. The only mistake, I said, was thinking I wouldn't fight back. That I'd accept whatever terms you dictated because I always have before. But things have changed, Ryan. I've changed. My phone buzzed with a text from Diane. Asset freeze granted, banks being notified now. I showed the message to Emma, whose smile was coldly triumphant. Perfect timing, she murmured. What is it? Ryan demanded, his eyes darting between us. What's happening? You should check your banking app, I suggested mildly. You might find some unexpected developments. His expression suspicious, Ryan pulled out his phone and opened his banking application. I watched as confusion, then shock, then fury crossed his face in rapid succession. What have you done? He whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. Nothing compared to what you did, I replied. The court has frozen your assets pending investigation into wire fraud and improper transfer of property, including the money you received from Westlake. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You've lost your mind. This isn't you, Sarah. This isn't who you are. You're right, I agreed. It isn't who I was. But it's who I am now. Someone who won't be manipulated or dismissed or defrauded. Someone who fights for what's rightfully hers. For a moment, Ryan seemed at a loss for words, his carefully scripted life veering wildly off course. Then his expression hardened. This isn't over. You have no idea what you're doing. Actually, I said, stepping past him toward the door with Emma at my side. For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing, and it feels incredible. The weeks following our confrontation with Ryan passed in a blur of legal meetings, court appearances, and emotional reckonings. The notary fraud turned out to be the linchpin that unraveled his entire scheme. Patricia Vega's company expense reports clearly showed she had been in Seattle on the day she supposedly notarized our refinancing documents in person. When faced with potential criminal charges, she quickly admitted that Ryan had asked her to backdate her notarization, claiming it was just a formality to fix a clerical error. That admission, combined with the evidence of wire fraud and the documentation of my inheritance contribution to the house purchase, gave Diane everything she needed. The court invalidated the deed transfer, recognizing my joint ownership of the property, and the asset freeze remained in place while forensic accountants traced the money Ryan had hidden in offshore accounts. Westlake Development, incensed by Ryan's deception, withdrew their offer entirely and filed their own lawsuit against him for misrepresentation. The earnest money they'd paid, what remained of it after Ryan's hasty transfers, was ordered returned. Through it all, Ryan maintained a facade of righteous indignation, alternating between angry accusations and attempts at manipulation. "This is all a misunderstanding," he claimed during one court hearing, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Sarah is distraught about our marriage ending and lashing out." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, had merely raised an eyebrow and pointed to the notarization evidence before ruling in my favor. Vanessa disappeared from the picture almost immediately after the extent of Ryan's fraud became clear. Emma's friend at Meridian Advertising reported that she'd abruptly resigned, citing personal reasons. When subpoenaed to testify about her knowledge of the offshore accounts, she claimed total ignorance, insisting she'd believed Ryan's assurances that everything was above board. "Do you believe her?" I asked Diane after that particular hearing. "It doesn't really matter," she replied pragmatically. "What matters is that Ryan's plan has collapsed entirely. He's lost Vanessa. He's facing potential criminal charges. His professional reputation is in tatters, and he's hemorrhaging money on legal fees." It should have felt triumphant, watching the man who had so callously planned to discard me face the consequences of his actions. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, grief, and, increasingly, a sense of liberation that surprised me with its intensity. 6 months after Ryan's devastating phone call, we finalized our divorce settlement. With his legal position crumbling and the prospect of criminal charges looming, he agreed to terms that would have been unimaginable that first day. Equal division of all assets, including those he'd tried to hide offshore. Ownership of the house transferred solely to me, and a substantial cash settlement to compensate for the emotional distress and financial deception. "You won," Emma said as we left the courthouse on a crisp autumn day, the final papers signed and filed. "Everything he tried to take from you, you got back." I paused on the courthouse steps, considering her words. "It wasn't about winning," I said finally. "It was about not letting him erase me. About standing up for myself after years of being diminished." She looped her arm through mine as we descended to the street. "So what now? Will you keep the house?" I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. The house that had once been my passion project, my canvas, now held memories that felt tainted. I'd spent countless hours making it beautiful, but I'd done so while blind to the ugliness growing within my marriage. "No," I said decisively. "I'm going to sell it, legitimately this time, and use the proceeds to start fresh." And that's exactly what I did. The house sold within a month, to a young family who fell in love with the renovations I'd poured my heart into. The wife, an artist, had gazed admiringly at the studio space I'd created in the basement, her eyes alight with possibilities. Watching them plan where their children's beds would go, which walls they'd hang their family photos on, I felt a weight lifting. The house would have a second life, filled with love and honesty this time. With my share of the proceeds, I did something Ryan never would have allowed during our marriage. I opened my own interior design firm. Not just freelance work on the side, but a proper business with commercial office space in an up-and-coming neighborhood. I named it Phoenix Designs, a private acknowledgement of my own rebirth from the ashes of my marriage. Ryan's final downfall came not through my efforts but through his own hubris. Facing mounting legal bills and desperate to maintain the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to, he attempted to divert funds from client accounts at his agency. The fraud was discovered almost immediately, resulting in his termination and industry-wide blacklisting. The last I heard, he was facing criminal charges and had moved to a smaller city, all traces of his former swagger erased. A year to the day after that phone call that had shattered my world, I hosted the grand opening of my design studio. The space was everything I'd ever dreamed of, flooded with natural light, showcasing sustainable materials, and featuring furniture from local artisans. The centerpiece was a wall displaying photographs of my renovation projects, tangible proof of what I'd accomplished despite years of being told my work was just a cute hobby. Emma arrived early, champagne in hand, her pride evident as she surveyed what I'd built. "Remember when you thought you couldn't manage a hotel redesign project?" she asked, referencing the opportunity Ryan had convinced me to turn down years ago. I smiled, because the universe has a sense of humor. My newest client was the very same boutique hotel chain, now expanding to 3 new locations and hiring Phoenix Designs to oversee the interior concepts for all of them. "I remember a lot of things," I said, accepting the glass she offered. "But I'm trying not to dwell on them. This is about moving forward, not looking back." The studio filled with guests, friends, fellow designers, potential clients, and even Mrs. Peterson from my old neighborhood, who'd become an unexpected ally during the darker days of the divorce. Diane arrived fashionably late, turning heads in her impeccable suit, a small smile of satisfaction playing at her lips as she took in my success. To Sarah, Emma toasted as the evening reached its peak, who reminded us all that it's never too late to reclaim your power and build the life you deserve. The glasses clinked, the sound bright and clear in the space I had created entirely on my own terms. Later, after the last guests had departed and I stood alone in my studio, I found myself drawn to the window overlooking the city skyline. Somewhere, in those twinkling lights, was the life I'd left behind. The beautiful prison of a marriage where I'd slowly surrendered my agency, my confidence, and nearly my future. I thought about Ryan's voice on that fateful day, so cold and dismissive as he announced the end of our life together. "I'm divorcing you," he'd said, so certain of his control over the situation. "I've already sold the house." He'd been wrong about so many things. About the house, about his clever plan, about my willingness to fight back. But most of all, he'd been wrong about me. He'd seen me as a supporting character in his life story, someone to be managed and eventually discarded when convenient. What he hadn't counted on, what I hadn't even fully recognized myself until pushed to the breaking point, was my resilience. My capacity to reclaim not just what was rightfully mine in material terms, but to reclaim myself in ways that transcended bank accounts and property deeds. As I turned out the lights in my studio that night, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Instead, I felt something simpler and more profound: gratitude. Not for what Ryan had done, his betrayal remained unforgivable, but for what his actions had ultimately forced me to discover. In trying to erase me from his life, he had inadvertently helped me find myself. In planning his exit, he had paved the way for my emergence. In underestimating me so completely, he had created the perfect conditions for me to finally recognize my own strength. I locked the door to Phoenix Designs, my fingers tracing the logo I'd designed myself. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new challenges, new opportunities to create beauty on my own terms. The past was behind me, but it had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. Ryan had laughed that day, so certain of his victory. But I was the one moving forward, rebuilding not just a home but a life, not despite his betrayal, but because of it. And that, perhaps, was the most perfect justice of all.